Hi everyone, welcome back for Chapter 3 Agent Acquisition. This is part 2 of the lecture. So just a reminder, we are talking about the neurobiological considerations in terms of how age affects language learning. In the first part of the presentation, we discussed the brain and also this concept of lateralization of the brain. Okay, so now we're going to move on and talk a little bit about biological about the anthropological evidence about time limits. So what Brown gave us was this idea that there is a group called the Tucano people, and that they have some cultural rules, one being that they must marry someone from a different village, and the villages all speak different languages. So they have to learn this new language to become a part of the new family and to integrate into the village. All right. And they are able to do this with and achieve native-like proficiency. All right. Obviously, there's no instruction that happens. There's no classroom that says, okay, so you're going to marry this girl from, you know, X village, so you need to go to class and you need to learn this language. It's something that happens organically as part of the culture. So it's part of a cultural expectation that they will achieve the language they need in order to become part of the new spouse's family and village. Okay. If you're interested in finding out more, I did find this really interesting article about the Tucano. It explains where they are, what are all the different languages, a little bit more about the culture. And I think in this case, so this is actually some evidence that age is not a factor. um, but what it does have going for it is the idea of some sort of cultural expectation. You know, the idea that, hey, you're going to learn a new language, so, get over it. That's just the way it is. And perhaps that has some more significant impact than the critical period hypothesis. So we don't know, but this is evidence that, there may be not a time limit for learning language. All right. So the next thing we're talking about with critical period hypothesis is the idea of accent. All right. And this is still part of the neurobiological considerations. So what we know about accent is, you know, a native-like accent post-puberty is highly unlikely when you're learning a second language. If any of you have had the experience of learning a second language, uh, post seventh, eighth grade, you know that it's quite difficult to sound native-like. That doesn't mean it's impossible. It doesn't mean that some people don't have a knack or a talent for that, but it is far more difficult. And there are several factors involved in this, and something that a lot of research has not been done, but if you consider it in terms of just the matter of factness, that in producing language, we know that there are many muscles and that there are many nerves involved, and your production becomes specialized. Throat, jaw, mouth, tongue. You become specialized for speaking the language that you grow up speaking. And even the way your mouth moves, and I don't know if you ever have watched people who speak different languages, but the way that you move your mouth, how much you open it, how wide it gets, how long it gets, this changes from language to language. And if you speak a language as a first language that is very unemotive, that the lips don't move a lot, the mouth doesn't move a lot, and then you try to speak a language that's a lot more active, it can be quite difficult. It's physiologically difficult. All right. Brain development, you know, can affect accent. There are cultural expectations, as we talked about in the previous point about the Tucano people. And interestingly, Um, Critical period hypothesis, CPH, has been shown in research to be the most clearly or closely related to accent. So there's not a lot of research that proves definitively when the CPH is and what it does, except that there has been enough research that we can conclude that there is a critical period for the majority of people to learn a new language and become native-like in the accent. Okay? Which for me leads to a question, if a second language native-like accent, acquiring it is highly improbable after puberty, when we think this CPH is a native-like accent necessary? Is that something we should strive for? Is that something we should try to achieve as learners, or something that we should expect of our students? And I don't know that I believe that anymore. I used to as a teacher be like, oh no, you got to say it this way, but maybe understanding, being understood or comprehensibility is enough. All right. Maybe we're asking our students too much to do too much. All right. Also depends on what age you're teaching. For adults, going to be a lot harder. For younger people, might have more opportunities. All right, so next, number two in the considerations about age and language, we have these cognitive considerations. If you're coming from an education background, or if you've got like ECE, early childhood stuff, you've likely talked about Piaget and these stages of learning and all of that. That has something to do with how you learn a second language, right? That there is some sort of sequence that you go through. But when we look at Piaget's, stages of intellectual development, we can think about how could L2 learning be impacted by these kinds of stages? Do we even follow as adults these same stages? So what we know about Piaget is you've got the sensory motor stage, which is from birth to 2, where babies are focusing on what is in front of them, right? And it's very self-explanatory. Sensory, they're focusing on the senses. Motor skills, the ability to grab things, hold on to things. And then from age 2 to 7, you have the pre-operational stage, where the child is able to think symbolically. All right, and you sometimes will see that in language represented. And then you have the operational stage. There are sort of two stages to that. Operational goes from 7 to 16. We've got concrete operational from 7 to 11. The child is becoming less egocentric and can think more concretely. And then formal operational from 11 to 16. And the belief is that at age 11, a child is capable of abstract thought that goes beyond some sort of concrete experience. This is puberty. So if you think about CPH in terms of Piaget's stages of intellectual development, there does seem to be some sort of shift in the brain, right? Moving from sort of like, sort of being set in the real, what is real, what is tactile, what is easily identifiable, to around age 11 or 12, when the abstraction starts coming in. And so there's got to be stuff that's happening in the brain that is affecting the learning process, making it different, possibly. All right. Another thing to consider in terms of these cognitive considerations would be the idea of implicit learning versus explicit learning. So implicit learning is when you're not making any effort. You're using, learning becomes part of a goal, a process towards a goal, whereas explicit learning is conscious learning. And we know that kids, they don't really pay attention to learning, especially when they're young. They're just doing things, they're trying things, everything goes in their mouth. And they're just trying everything. And then learning becomes more conscious, especially when they start going to school. So are children better second language learners because they are not conscious of the fact that they're learning? What sort of impact does that have? And if it is part of what makes children good learners, good language learners, is there a way to extract that for adults and make that part of their experience? Uh, Recently, there's been a lot of talk about project-based learning, even in, L2. So in that case, the language is not the focus. The language is the tool for completing the project. And so that is a more implicit environment in which to learn language. Um, Personally, I think for adults you need both. I think you need explicit um, explanations, teaching. You need to be descriptive, but you also need some implicit or non-conscious use of language where you can just use it and practice it and not be concerned about the correctness. All right. There's this other concept, again, back to Piaget, equilibration, where, you move through stages from doubt to uncertainty, um, figuring things out. And this is occurring around age 16. So up until that point, there's a lot of movement from doubt to uncertainty to figure things out. But, um, well, you know, age 16, is that another critical period or is that part of the critical period? Um, so I don't know. Like I said, there's not a lot that we can say emphatically that's true or not true. Okay, but moving from confusion, all right, confusion to got it. All right, let's go on. All right, now there are other things such as affective considerations. And affect includes things like empathy, self-esteem, extroversion and introversion, or inhibition, right? Empathy meaning your ability to connect with the language group, the language culture. Self-esteem, your belief in yourself and your ability to do something. That's really important in learning. When you don't think you can do something, it's sort of just self, not prophesizing. You end up not being able to do it because you believe you can't do it. Extroversion and introversion, there are benefits to being an extrovert for language learning. There are benefits to being an introvert for language learning. And then inhibition, we have found that, as you become older, you develop something called the affective filter, which means you learn you learn that you don't want to feel embarrassed, and that you care about what other people think. And inhibition can cause you to be mm, less experimental and less willing to make mistakes. An interesting study I read many years ago was about alcohol and language learning. And in adults, obviously adults, they did some studies about alcohol and whether or not having a little bit of alcohol helps you learn a language better. And in some of the studies, it did. Just a little alcohol. Then, if you had more, it did not help at all. You were lost. But it's the idea that there is something that holds us back as adults from being as joyful and sort of loose in learning that we have when we're children. Okay, so that can affect how we learn a language, and it's definitely something that comes on more strongly as adults. Excuse me. Now, there are also linguistic considerations to think about in terms of like bilingualism. There are two kinds of bilingualism where you have coordinate bilingualism, where you have two languages learned in two separate contexts and probably learned at different times. So you might have a home language and then you have a school language. A lot of in this area, we have a lot of people who speak one language at home predominantly, and then they go to school and they speak mostly English, or if they're going to a bilingual school or a monolingual non-English school, they're going to speak that other language. So that's a situation where you're going to have a bilingual. They're learning two complete sets of language. Their brains, got different parts for both of those languages, but the contexts are different. And then you can have compound bilingualism, where you've got one context for both languages. They're being learned simultaneously, and they're probably being used in slightly different ways. But there are a lot of people who grow up in their family, as bilinguals or trilinguals. I remember when I was in university, I babysat for a young girl. I think she was 5 or 6. She was my Portuguese teacher's child, and he was Portuguese, and his wife was Puerto Rican. So he spoke Portuguese to the child, and she spoke Spanish, and they were living in the United States. So she actually was growing up trilingual, and it was fascinating to try and communicate with her because her sentences were full of 3 languages, and it was, my brain was, jumping around trying to figure out what she was saying. But it was really cool to watch that process. All right. So what else? You also have to think about interference. What is the effect of the first language on the second language? This is going to be stronger in adults because you have had longer speaking the first language. You've got a deeper knowledge of the first language. So it's kind of, common sense that it would have some sort of effect. And then another thing is this order of acquisition. And I want you to think about the morpheme studies in universal grammar from chapter 2. If you want to read some recent research on this with an updated perspective, go to this link because it was a fascinating article. A little bit heavy, but not too bad. But basically, and if you don't know about the morpheme studies, it was bringing together a series of studies investigating the acquisition order of grammatical morphemes by first language and second language learners. And they wanted to see if there was like a universal pattern in the acquisition order of morphemes, whether or not they were in the first language or the second language. Okay, and the reason because they wanted to see if there was some sort of existence of this universal mechanism. This relates, like I said, to UG, universal grammar. So in the review of the studies, they figured out that second language learners do follow some sort of universal order in the acquisition of second language English morphemes. And so it doesn't matter what first language you had, that when you're learning English, you acquire these morphemes in the same order. And this is still these were done a while ago, and this is still a very, very strongly held belief now. Recent research in SLA, though, has shown that it's not just that we have this sort of order that we're all going to follow for learning these morphemes, but that also the first language has influence on the morphemes and how they're acquired. Especially if the morpheme is not in the first language, then there's lower accuracy. And so like if you're having to not only understand the morpheme, but it's also a new form, that's going to give you a harder time to learn it. Okay? And it gets worse as you get older. Okay. So how does this all relate to teaching? Well, you've got these 2 techniques that they talked about in the book. One is called TPR, Total Physical Response. Comes from the idea that children do a lot of listening before they speak, and listening's connected with movement and physical responses. So it's a way of letting the students start to speak when they feel like it, but also getting them moving when they are real beginners. And I mean, I've used TPR. It's for very absolute beginners, but there is something to be said for having a physical response that connects it to the brain in a different way. I will use physical action in my classrooms to help students connect to new ideas because there is a body-mind connection. We know that. There's also the natural approach, which was the idea was to give input, lots and lots of input, as much input as they could take to allow the production of language to emerge naturally and at the learner's own pace, as it is for children. We don't force children to produce language before they're ready. We can't. They do it when they're ready. But it's hard to replicate that in an adult environment. So yeah, but I do think the idea of input's very important, especially for adults. And that's something that we've learned from first language learning that we can apply to second language learning, the importance of input. All right, to summarize, there are many ways that age can and may influence second language acquisition, including the brain, how it develops, how it works, what it's doing, affect, how learners view their own experience, their aptitude, etc. Cultural expectations, what is expected of the second language learner? Where are they coming from? Where are they going to? It is clear from the research that age has an impact on second language learning. What is also clear is that it's an important, if not completely understood, part of SLA and TESOL. TESOL is teaching English to speakers of other languages. If you go back to page 69 of the textbook, Brown gives a really good summary of the findings about age and learning, and which ones have been proven or seem to be leading towards one kind of assistance or another. But please make sure you check that out and spend a couple of minutes looking at it. Okay, so I hope you have enjoyed this chapter. I think the whole concept of age and language learning is fascinating, whether or not you're talking about the first language or the second language. And I hope that you feel like you understand things a little bit better. Please, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me or set up some sort of Blackboard conference. And I really suggest go back, read the chapter one more time if you have the opportunity. You'll get so much more out of it. All right, thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in chapter 5. Bye.